In the late 19th century, Ethiopia stood as an ancient and proud kingdom, a beacon of resistance to the growing tide of European colonialism sweeping across Africa. In the far northeastern horn of the continent, this nation had survived centuries of foreign incursions and internal turmoil, maintaining a level of sovereignty and distinct cultural identity that many others had lost to European imperialism. The story of Ethiopia's resilience against foreign domination is inextricably linked to the rise of one remarkable leader, Emperor Menelik II. His reign, and the events leading to the Battle of Adwa in 1896, would etch Ethiopia's name in history as the first African nation to decisively defeat a European imperial power, setting a precedent that would inspire the continent for generations. At the heart of Menelik's rise was a deep understanding of Ethiopia's complex social, political, and military structures. Born in 1844 to the royal family of Shua, one of the kingdoms that would eventually be unified under Menelik's leadership, he was trained in the traditions of both warrior and statesman. As a young prince, he was exiled to the far reaches of the Ethiopian highlands in the late 19th century, far from the imperial court of the Emperor Tawadros II. But it was during this period of exile that Menelik sharpened his political acumen and learned the dynamics of Ethiopia's diverse ethnic and regional factions. Ethiopia's political landscape at the time was a patchwork of regional kingdoms, each with its own autonomy and often competing interests. The central government, under Emperor Tawadros, struggled to consolidate control, and by the time Menelik was thrust into the political fray, the Ethiopian empire was far from unified. Menelik, however, was a pragmatist. He realized early on that the key to success would lie in his ability to unite these disparate regions, build alliances, and cultivate a strong military force. His ability to bridge the divides between Ethiopia's diverse peoples, which included the Amharas, Tigray, Oromos, and others, would become a hallmark of his leadership. In 1865, when Emperor Tawadros took Menelik's father hostage as part of an effort to strengthen his control over the empire, Menelik's ambitions shifted. His exile had been forced, but it provided him the space to build his reputation as a leader. During these years, Menelik demonstrated an uncanny ability to navigate Ethiopia's politics, working with local chiefs and warlords, learning from both their successes and mistakes. As he forged these connections, Menelik increasingly became a symbol of Ethiopian unity, a leader capable of uniting the fractured kingdom. By 1883, after Tawadros' tragic death at the hands of British forces, Menelik returned to the capital, Addis Ababa, where he claimed the throne as the new emperor. The central government was still in disarray, and Menelik faced immediate challenges, but his political savvy and military leadership were undeniable. His marriage to Empress Teta Batul, an astute and politically capable woman, also played a crucial role in solidifying his position. Teta was not just Menelik's wife, but a powerful ally who played a key role in his rise to power, particularly in managing the administration and rallying support among various factions. However, Menelik's reign was soon tested by the rise of European imperial ambitions, particularly the Italian quest for colonial expansion. In the late 19th century, European powers, emboldened by the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which divided Africa among themselves, turned their attention to Ethiopia. Italy, having already established a colony in Eritrea, sought to expand its holdings and establish dominance over the entire Horn of Africa. The Italian military, although formidable, was less experienced in the rough, mountainous terrain of Ethiopia, where the political landscape was a maze of regional powers with deep cultural ties to the land. Italy's interest in Ethiopia was framed under the guise of diplomacy. In 1889, Menelik and Italy signed the Treaty of Wuchel, a document meant to define the borders between the two nations. However, the treaty contained a critical flaw, an ambiguous article concerning Ethiopia's sovereignty. The Italian translation of the treaty suggested that Ethiopia was now a protectorate of Italy, giving the Italian government authority over Ethiopia's foreign policy. Menelik, however, read the treaty as a standard border agreement and assumed full independence for his nation. This misunderstanding, whether deliberate or unintentional, would set the stage for the inevitable conflict that would soon unfold. The breach of trust between the two nations escalated quickly when, in 1895, the Italian government, led by Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, decided to assert its influence over Ethiopia. Italy's demands were clear. Menelik must accept the terms of the treaty as they were interpreted by Italy or face military intervention. This was no empty threat. The Italian forces, though inexperienced in the rugged Ethiopian terrain, had significant military resources and believed that their superior firepower could easily overwhelm the Ethiopians. What Italy had underestimated, however, was the deep sense of national pride that ran through Ethiopia. For centuries, the Ethiopian people had maintained their independence from foreign domination, and Menelik was determined to preserve that legacy. His diplomatic efforts failed to calm the tensions, and Menelik's resolve hardened. He called upon his people to prepare for war, rallying a diverse coalition of regional leaders, tribal chiefs, and warriors from across Ethiopia's vast and varied landscapes. The emperor's efforts to unify his fractured kingdom were now paying off. Ethiopia's military preparedness was shaped by its history. Menelik was not just preparing for any war. He was preparing for a war that would define Ethiopia's future. Ethiopia's soldiers, motivated by a deep sense of national pride, were eager to fight. They were battle-hardened and familiar with their homeland's difficult geography. The men, women, and leaders who followed Menelik understood that this was not just a battle for survival, but for Ethiopia's soul. The stakes were high, and the people of Ethiopia were ready to make their stand. Menelik's leadership became a rallying point. His strategic brilliance, combined with the devotion of his people, would soon prove to be Italy's undoing. What Italy had expected to be a quick and decisive conquest was soon to become a protracted and catastrophic conflict. The coming battle would not only test Menelik's leadership, but would also reveal the lengths to which Ethiopia would go to preserve its sovereignty. It was against this backdrop of rising tension, political maneuvering, and military buildup that the stage was set for one of the most significant moments in African history. The events that would unfold in the following years were not just about the future of Ethiopia, but the future of the entire African continent, as the world watched a nation refuse to bow to the pressures of European colonialism. This was the beginning of a new chapter in Ethiopian history, one that would see a proud, independent nation challenge the might of an imperial power and change the course of history forever. In the years leading up to the conflict, Menelik's focus had been on consolidating his rule, managing the complex relationships with various ethnic groups, and preparing his army. But there was something more profound at work. The rise of an awareness in Ethiopia's people that their struggle was not just about defending their king or their lands, but about defending their very identity against a colonial world that threatened to erase it. Menelik's leadership had forged an Ethiopia that was more than a kingdom. It was a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for all of Africa. The stage was set for the clash that would come to define the fate of a nation. In the closing decades of the 19th century, as European powers scrambled to carve up Africa, Ethiopia stood as a singular and defined exception. The continent was being reshaped by the forces of imperialism, and the once thriving African kingdoms were being reduced to mere pawns on the global stage. However, Ethiopia, deeply rooted in its ancient history and traditions, remained an independent kingdom, an anomaly in a world rapidly succumbing to colonial domination. At the heart of this resistance was Emperor Menelik II, who would become the face of Ethiopia's unyielding defiance against European colonial expansion, especially that of Italy, a nation eager to establish its foothold in East Africa. By the time Menelik ascended to the throne of Ethiopia in 1889, the political landscape of Africa had been irrevocably altered. The scramble for Africa, a period in which European powers partitioned the continent among themselves, was in full swing. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, European nations formalized their imperial claims on Africa, setting the boundaries for future colonies and establishing a system of dominance over the native peoples. Ethiopia was one of the few exceptions to this wave of imperial conquest. Its unique position, both geographically and politically, made it a target for colonization, but also a symbol of resistance to foreign domination. At this time, Italy, which had only recently unified as a nation in 1861, was eager to assert its influence and power on the international stage. As part of its colonial ambitions, Italy set its sights on the Horn of Africa, particularly on the region that would eventually become Eritrea. By the 1880s, Italy had established a presence in the region, claiming Eritrea as an Italian colony. But Italy's expansionist ambitions did not end there. The Italian government sought to extend its colonial holdings into Ethiopia, which was seen as the last independent African power in the face of European imperialism. The Italian government, under Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, sought to expand its influence by gaining control over Ethiopia, a country rich in resources and strategically important in the geopolitics of the region. Italy's expansion into Ethiopia, however, would not be a straightforward affair. Unlike other African regions, Ethiopia was not fragmented or easily conquered. Its mountainous terrain and its long history of independence made it a formidable adversary for any foreign power. Yet Italy's imperialist ambitions were relentless. It sought to negotiate a treaty with Menelik II that would grant Italy a protectorate over Ethiopia, thereby securing its colonial foothold in the Horn of Africa. In 1889, the Treaty of Adwa was signed between Italy and Menelik II. On the surface, the treaty was a diplomatic agreement meant to establish the terms of Italy's presence in Ethiopia. The document outlined the boundaries between Italy's colony in Eritrea and Ethiopia, and it also gave Italy the right to represent Ethiopia in foreign affairs. However, the treaty contained a crucial point of contention: the interpretation of Article 17, which, in the Italian version of the treaty, implied that Ethiopia would be a protectorate of Italy. This would mean that Menelik's government would lose its sovereignty and Italy would gain control over Ethiopia's foreign policy. Menelik, however, read the treaty differently. In the Amharic version of the document, there was no mention of Ethiopia becoming a protectorate. Instead, Menelik understood the treaty as a simple border agreement between two independent nations. This misunderstanding would soon lead to a diplomatic crisis. Menelik's belief in Ethiopia's sovereignty and his refusal to concede to Italian control over his country would set the stage for a military confrontation that would have far-reaching consequences. The Italian government, under Crispi's leadership, soon grew frustrated with Menelik's refusal to accept the terms of the treaty as interpreted by Italy. The diplomatic negotiations faltered, and by 1895, tensions between Italy and Ethiopia had reached a boiling point. Italy, underestimating the strength and unity of the Ethiopian people, began to prepare for military action. It was confident that its superior military technology and organization would quickly defeat Menelik and bring Ethiopia into the fold of European colonial powers. However, Menelik was not one to be easily intimidated. His decision to resist Italian encroachment was not made in haste. It was a decision born of Ethiopia's long history of independence and pride. Ethiopia had fought off numerous foreign invaders over the centuries, from the Egyptians to the Ottoman Turks, and Menelik knew that his people would not tolerate another foreign conquest. He was determined to protect Ethiopia's sovereignty, and he understood that the stakes were far higher than just a border dispute. The outcome of this confrontation would determine whether Ethiopia would remain free or fall under the rule of European imperialism. As Italy's military preparations advanced, Menelik began to organize his forces. He called upon Ethiopia's diverse ethnic groups to unite against the common threat. Despite their differences, the Ethiopian people were unified by a common cause: the defense of their homeland. Menelik's ability to rally the various factions of Ethiopian society was a testament to his leadership and his understanding of the country's complex political landscape. Ethiopia was not a homogeneous nation. It was a patchwork of different cultures, languages, and traditions. Yet Menelik's vision of a unified Ethiopia, one that could withstand external threats, resonated deeply with his people. Menelik's military strategy was also shaped by Ethiopia's unique geography. The country's rugged terrain, with its mountains, plateaus, and forests, would be a decisive factor in the coming conflict. Menelik's forces knew the land intimately, and they would use this knowledge to their advantage. The Italians, on the other hand, were unfamiliar with the harsh conditions of the Ethiopian highlands. Their overconfidence in their military superiority would soon prove to be a critical miscalculation. The Ethiopian army, led by Menelik and his trusted generals, began to prepare for war. The Ethiopian military was composed of both regular soldiers and local militias, many of whom had fought in previous battles against foreign invaders. The warriors were armed with a mix of traditional weapons and modern firearms, which Menelik had acquired through diplomatic efforts with European powers. These weapons, along with Ethiopia's strong sense of nationalism and pride, would play a crucial role in the coming battle. In the meantime, Italy continued its preparations for war, sending troops into Ethiopia's northern regions in an attempt to assert its control. The Italian forces were confident in their ability to overwhelm the Ethiopians, believing that their modern artillery and organized military structure would give them a decisive advantage. Yet, in their arrogance, they failed to account for the Ethiopian spirit and resilience. As the Italian forces advanced, Menelik began to prepare for the inevitable clash. His decision to resist Italian colonial ambitions would be the catalyst for a conflict that would change the course of African history. The conflict that began as a diplomatic dispute over a treaty would soon escalate into a full-scale war, with Ethiopia's survival at stake. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would not only determine the future of Ethiopia, but also have profound implications for the broader African continent. For Ethiopia, the stakes were not merely about the preservation of borders. They were about the preservation of its identity, its sovereignty, and its place in the world. The outcome of this struggle would send a powerful message to the colonial powers of Europe, that African nations, even in the face of overwhelming odds, could still stand up to imperialism and win. The battle for Ethiopia's survival had begun. As the political tensions between Italy and Ethiopia deepened, it became increasingly clear that the dispute over the Treaty of Adwa was not going to be resolved through diplomacy alone. The diplomatic missteps, the failure of both parties to reach a common understanding, and the growing sense of urgency in the Italian government laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most significant military confrontations in African history. For Menelik II, the situation had evolved from a simple misunderstanding into an existential struggle for Ethiopia's sovereignty and its place in the global order. The Italian government's interpretation of the treaty, that Ethiopia would become a protectorate of Italy, was not only a violation of Ethiopian independence, but also an affront to Menelik's authority. Menelik, who had always prided himself on Ethiopia's autonomy, could not accept the notion of foreign powers dictating his country's foreign policy. To him, the treaty was a misunderstanding, an issue that could have been solved with clearer communication and mutual respect. However, Italy's insistence on its version of the treaty left him with no choice but to prepare for war. The failure of diplomacy was evident from the moment Italy began to escalate its military presence in the region. Italy, led by Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, had been building its colonial ambitions in Africa for years, and Menelik's refusal to accept their terms was seen as a challenge to their imperial goals. The Italian leadership, particularly Crispi, was determined to expand Italy's colonial empire and sought to assert dominance in the Horn of Africa. Menelik's Ethiopia, which had long been a symbol of African independence, stood as a barrier to those ambitions. Despite the escalating tensions, Menelik remained patient and calculated. He had always understood the power of diplomacy and had tried, through various channels, to resolve the dispute without resorting to war. He sent multiple letters to the Italian government, seeking clarification of the treaty's terms, but these attempts were met with indifference and increasing hostility. By the time 1895 arrived, the situation was no longer one of diplomatic negotiation. It had become a full-blown crisis. Italy, after numerous failed attempts at diplomacy, decided to escalate its military strategy. The Italian government began to mobilize its troops in Eritrea and prepare for an invasion of Ethiopia. The Italian forces, while equipped with modern weaponry, were inexperienced in the harsh and unforgiving terrain of Ethiopia. They underestimated both the strategic acumen of Menelik and the determination of the Ethiopian people. They believed that their superior artillery and technological advancements would ensure a swift victory. But they were blind to the unyielding spirit of a nation whose survival depended on resisting foreign encroachment. Menelik, in the face of Italian threats, began to take decisive action. He knew that to defeat Italy, he needed not only to unite the various Ethiopian factions, but also to build a strong, coordinated defense. His approach to war was grounded in the belief that Ethiopia's survival depended on the mobilization of every resource, every ally, and every possible advantage. The emperor's ability to bring together the various regional factions of Ethiopia, who were often divided along ethnic, religious, and political lines, was one of his greatest strengths. The unity he forged among these disparate groups would become one of the most significant factors in Ethiopia's success against Italy. The Ethiopian military, although lacking the advanced technology of the Italians, was highly adaptable and deeply familiar with the terrain. Menelik had long understood the importance of strategic advantage, and he knew that Ethiopia's mountainous landscape, with its rugged terrain and narrow passes, would be a key asset in any conflict. His forces, familiar with the land, would be able to use it to their advantage. They would not face the Italians in open battle on flat plains, but would instead draw them into the mountains, where their technological superiority would be neutralized. In addition to rallying his forces, Menelik also sought to strengthen his diplomatic ties with other powers. While he had hoped that European nations would recognize Ethiopia's right to sovereignty, he was realistic about the need to secure his position on the global stage. He reached out to Russia, which had an interest in countering Italy's colonial ambitions, and to France, with whom Ethiopia had a long-standing relationship. These alliances, while not without their complexities, served to bolster Menelik's position and send a clear message to Italy that Ethiopia was not isolated in its resistance. Italy, on the other hand, was struggling to maintain the facade of diplomatic propriety while preparing for war. Its leadership was divided over the issue of Ethiopia. Crispi, with his imperial ambitions, pushed for military action, while others within the Italian government were more cautious, realizing that the consequences of a military failure could be disastrous. Despite this internal division, the Italian military began its march toward Ethiopia, confident that their superior artillery and trained soldiers would quickly overpower the unprepared Ethiopians. In late 1895, the Italian forces, numbering around 17,000 soldiers, advanced from Eritrea into northern Ethiopia. They expected the campaign to be swift and decisive, with the capture of the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, as the ultimate goal. The Italian forces were organized into several columns, but their lack of coordination and their unfamiliarity with the Ethiopian terrain were soon exposed. The Italians had underestimated the logistical challenges of operating in the highlands and underestimated the resolve of the Ethiopian soldiers, who were led by their determined emperor. Menelik, having spent years preparing for this moment, had already assembled an army of his own. His forces, though not as well equipped as the Italians, were formidable. Menelik had drawn upon Ethiopia's diverse regions, uniting various ethnic groups, including the Amhara, Tigray, Oromo, and others, under the banner of national unity. The warriors, armed with a mix of traditional weapons and firearms, were motivated by a sense of patriotism and the desire to preserve their way of life. As the Italians advanced, Menelik made the decision to strike first. The Ethiopian forces, having gained intelligence on the movements of the Italian columns, decided to confront them in a series of smaller engagements, drawing the Italians further into the mountainous terrain. The Ethiopian army's tactics relied on speed, mobility, and knowledge of the land. Menelik understood that the strength of his army lay not in its ability to match the Italians' fire for fire, but in its capacity to wear down the invaders through guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and strikes at the Italian supply lines. Meanwhile, Italy's diplomatic efforts continued to unravel. The failure of their military progress, coupled with growing international condemnation of their invasion, left Italy in an increasingly precarious position. European powers, many of whom had vested interests in maintaining the balance of power in Africa, began to question the wisdom of Italy's colonial ambitions. While Italy hoped to establish dominance over Ethiopia, they were now facing the possibility of diplomatic isolation and military failure. In Ethiopia, Menelik's ability to maintain control over his diverse forces and to coordinate their movements was proving invaluable. He had carefully prepared for the challenges of war and had, over the years, built a sense of unity and purpose among his people. His leadership, though often underappreciated by foreign observers, was rooted in a deep understanding of Ethiopia's history, culture, and the challenges of its geography. Menelik had become more than just a king. He was a symbol of resistance against the encroaching colonial forces, a figurehead around whom the Ethiopian people could rally. As Italy continued its march toward Ethiopia's heartland, it became increasingly apparent that the conflict would not be the easy victory that many had predicted. The Ethiopian people, under Menelik's guidance, were prepared to defend their nation to the last. What had begun as a diplomatic conflict was now a full-scale war, with the fate of Ethiopia hanging in the balance. The coming months would determine whether Ethiopia would maintain its independence or succumb to the forces of European colonialism. In the face of Italy's military buildup and the mounting pressure to resolve the conflict, Menelik remained resolute. His refusal to submit to Italy's demands was not merely a political stance. It was an expression of Ethiopia's pride, its identity, and its unwavering commitment to its sovereignty. The battle that loomed on the horizon would not just decide the fate of Ethiopia, but would send a powerful message to the rest of Africa and the world, that Ethiopia, the last independent kingdom on the continent, would not fall without a fight. As the prospect of war loomed ever closer, the urgency of preparation weighed heavily on Menelik II. Ethiopia's survival depended on more than just diplomatic maneuvering or passive resistance. It would require a concerted, unified effort to mobilize the entire nation's resources. The impending conflict was not a localized skirmish, but a war for the future of Ethiopia itself. Menelik's leadership would be tested not only on the battlefield, but in his ability to transform Ethiopia into a formidable military power capable of holding its ground against the advancing Italian forces. Menelik had long been aware of the need to modernize Ethiopia's military. Despite Ethiopia's historical resilience, the kingdom had never faced an adversary as well-equipped or as strategically ambitious as Italy. The modern weaponry that Italy had at its disposal, including advanced artillery, rifles, and machine guns, gave them a distinct technological edge. Yet Menelik, a keen strategist, knew that his advantage would not lie in matching Italy's firepower, but in his ability to organize and unify Ethiopia's military forces, using the country's geography, its people, and their collective will as the central components of resistance. The first challenge Menelik faced was unifying the various factions of Ethiopia. The country was not a monolith, but a patchwork of different ethnic groups, religions, and regions, each with its own leaders, customs, and, at times, rivalries. The Amhara, the Tigray, the Oromo, and numerous smaller groups each had their own histories, identities, and sometimes conflicting interests. Ethiopia's strength had always been its ability to balance these regional differences, but the coming war would require a level of cooperation and coordination that had never been fully tested. Menelik's political and diplomatic skills were integral to overcoming these challenges. Over the years, he had carefully cultivated relationships with regional leaders and tribal chiefs, forging alliances that transcended ethnic and regional boundaries. He had come to understand that the strength of Ethiopia lay in its diversity and that the key to victory would be to forge a national identity, one that transcended individual group loyalties. The invasion of Italy became a unifying force, and Menelik's call to arms rallied the Ethiopian people, regardless of their background, to a common cause. Beyond political alliances, Menelik also needed to address the logistical challenges of mobilizing a nation at war. The Ethiopian military was not a standing army, but a system of regional militias and local forces. Traditionally, Ethiopian warfare relied on the ability of regional warlords to raise their own armies when needed. This decentralized structure, while effective in some contexts, presented a challenge when facing a modern, professional military like Italy's. Menelik's task was to organize these disparate forces into a unified, effective fighting force. He began by appointing trusted commanders to lead the various regional armies. These leaders were often seasoned warriors in their own right, skilled in the art of warfare, but they lacked experience in coordinating large, multinational forces. Menelik's solution was to maintain their regional autonomy while integrating their forces into a central command structure. He emphasized the importance of cooperation and mutual support between the various armies. Each leader was tasked with contributing to the overall strategy while ensuring that their own region's forces were adequately prepared for the coming conflict. Equally crucial to Menelik's strategy was the training and equipping of his soldiers. The Ethiopian military had long relied on traditional weapons, such as spears, swords, and shields. While these weapons were highly effective in close combat, they were no match for the modern firearms and artillery that Italy would bring to bear. Menelik understood that, in order to stand a chance against the Italians, Ethiopia would need to arm its soldiers with more advanced weaponry. The emperor took a pragmatic approach, using both diplomacy and trade to secure modern firearms from European countries that had historically been skeptical of Ethiopia's survival. While many European powers were reluctant to sell arms to a country resisting another European power, Menelik was able to broker deals with Russia and France, securing rifles, ammunition, and artillery that would give Ethiopia a fighting chance. The acquisition of these weapons was not without its challenges. Menelik faced the logistical nightmare of transporting weapons and ammunition through treacherous terrain, often with limited resources. Ethiopia's infrastructure was underdeveloped, and the journey from port to battlefield could take months. Yet, Menelik's leadership ensured that these supplies were gathered and distributed to the front lines in a timely manner. Ethiopia's soldiers, though not as well equipped as the Italians, would now be armed with modern rifles and artillery, which would prove essential in the upcoming battle. In parallel to military preparations, Menelik also turned his attention to the strategic use of Ethiopia's geography. The country's mountainous terrain had long been an asset in defense, as it provided natural barriers that could be used to limit the movement of invading armies. The Italian forces, though technologically superior, were unfamiliar with the harsh Ethiopian landscape. Menelik knew that Italy's advantage would be nullified if he could draw them into the mountains, where their artillery and heavy equipment would be rendered less effective. One of the key challenges in preparing for war was the question of morale. The Ethiopian people, despite centuries of internal division, shared a profound sense of national identity and pride in their history. For many, the prospect of Italian domination was unacceptable. Menelik's ability to inspire his people, to remind them of their heritage and their shared responsibility in defending their homeland, was critical to the success of the war effort. His speeches, though often simple, carried immense weight, stirring the hearts of both soldiers and civilians. Menelik was not just a political leader, but a symbol of Ethiopia's resilience and determination. As Ethiopia's forces continued to organize, the call to arms resonated across the country. The Ethiopian army swelled in size as men from all walks of life, from peasants to nobles, volunteered to take up arms against the Italian invaders. The war would not be fought by a professional army alone. It would be a national effort, with every able-bodied Ethiopian contributing to the defense of their country. The army was supplemented by militias, local forces, and even women who supported the war effort by providing supplies and tending to the wounded. This unification of the Ethiopian people under a common cause was not just a testament to Menelik's leadership, but also a reflection of the deep-rooted resistance to foreign domination that ran through the veins of Ethiopian society. The country had withstood foreign invasions for centuries, from the ancient Egyptians to the Ottoman Empire, and Menelik's leadership evoked the spirit of those past struggles. The Ethiopians were not merely defending their emperor. They were defending their very identity as a people and as a nation. As the military preparations neared completion, the situation in Italy grew more tense. The Italian public, eager for a quick victory, had grown restless. The Italian government had promised a swift and decisive campaign, but the reality of war in Ethiopia was proving far more complicated. Italian soldiers, ill-prepared for the harsh conditions of the Ethiopian highlands, began to face supply shortages and difficulty navigating the mountainous terrain. The morale of the Italian forces began to erode, and as they pushed deeper into Ethiopia, they encountered growing resistance from the Ethiopian soldiers, who knew their land better than their invaders ever could. The final preparations for battle were now in motion. Menelik's forces, though not as technologically advanced as Italy's, were united, motivated, and prepared to fight for their homeland. The Italians, confident in their military superiority, underestimated the Ethiopian spirit and the determination of its people. Menelik's ability to organize, inspire, and lead had transformed Ethiopia's defense into a formidable force. The stage was set for the inevitable clash, and the outcome of this conflict would not only determine Ethiopia's fate, but also send a powerful message to the rest of Africa and the colonial powers of Europe. Ethiopia would stand, or fall, on the strength of its unity, its resolve, and its will to resist. The Battle of Adwa was fast approaching, and with it, the fate of an entire nation. The date of reckoning had arrived. As the Italian forces advanced deeper into Ethiopia, the tension in the air was palpable. The diplomatic channels that had been exhausted and the military buildup on both sides had now reached their inevitable conclusion: war. Menelik II, having carefully prepared his forces, stood resolute in his determination to preserve Ethiopia's independence. For him, this was not just a battle for territorial integrity, but a fight for Ethiopia's very survival, its soul, and its identity. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine the fate of the Ethiopian kingdom and challenge the rising imperialist tide that threatened the entire continent. Menelik's forces, though not as technologically advanced as the Italians, had the advantage of both numbers and terrain. As the Italian army, a professional force equipped with modern rifles, artillery, and machine guns, marched towards the heart of Ethiopia, they were greeted not by the simple and unprepared resistance they had anticipated, but by the determined soldiers of Menelik who knew their homeland's rugged terrain better than any foreign invader could. The vast, unforgiving highlands of Ethiopia would become a critical part of the battlefield, a terrain that the Italians, unfamiliar with its complexities, would struggle to master. The Italian military leadership, led by General Oris Baratieri, had grown overconfident after their initial advances into Ethiopian territory. They believed that the sheer superiority of their artillery and the strength of their disciplined, modern army would quickly overwhelm the Ethiopians, who were largely armed with outdated rifles and traditional weapons. However, what they failed to account for was the deep sense of national pride and the unwavering resolve of the Ethiopian soldiers, who were fighting not just for their emperor, but for the future of their country. The Italian forces had originally entered Ethiopia from the north, advancing from Eritrea, and their strategic goal was clear: to defeat Menelik's army and capture Addis Ababa, the capital. They planned to assert Italian authority over the region, ensuring that Ethiopia would become another colony under European control. The Italians had encountered little resistance in the early stages of their advance, but as they moved closer to Menelik's strongholds, they began to feel the weight of the challenge ahead. Menelik's military leadership had been carefully honed over years of preparation. His ability to read the situation on the ground, his deep knowledge of Ethiopia's geography, and his understanding of the Ethiopian military's strengths and weaknesses all played a pivotal role in his strategic decisions. His forces, though seemingly outgunned and outmatched, had an edge in their mobility and the advantage of fighting on their home turf. In the months leading up to the inevitable battle, Menelik had made strategic decisions that would shape the course of the war. One of his most crucial moves was his decision to avoid a direct confrontation with the Italian forces early on. Instead, he sought to wear down the Italian military through a series of smaller engagements, limiting their supply lines and taking advantage of the difficult terrain. He knew that the Italians, despite their superior technology, would struggle to fight in the mountains, where their heavy artillery and supplies would be difficult to maneuver. In addition to the terrain, Menelik relied on a strategy of guerrilla warfare, striking at the Italian forces when they were most vulnerable. The Ethiopians were adept at using ambush tactics, often attacking in the early morning hours or under the cover of darkness. They would target Italian supply convoys, cutting off critical provisions and harassing the invaders' lines of communication. These skirmishes, while not decisive in themselves, began to take a toll on the Italian army's morale and resources. The Italians, expecting an easy conquest, found themselves bogged down by the Ethiopian resistance and the unforgiving environment. As the months passed, the Italians began to realize that this was no ordinary campaign. Menelik's forces had proven far more capable than they had anticipated, and the Ethiopian people, united behind their emperor, were willing to fight to the last man to protect their sovereignty. The Italian army, despite its superior firepower, was increasingly demoralized by the persistence of the Ethiopian resistance. General Baratieri and his commanders found it increasingly difficult to keep their soldiers motivated as they faced the harsh realities of war in an unfamiliar land. It was during this time that Menelik's leadership truly shone. He was not only a commander on a battlefield, but also a political leader who understood the importance of maintaining unity among Ethiopia's diverse people. The Ethiopian military was made up of warriors from various regions and ethnic groups, each with its own customs and traditions. Menelik's ability to unite these forces, to ensure that they fought not for their individual regions or tribes, but for the nation as a whole, was a testament to his political acumen and vision. The Ethiopian soldiers, many of whom had never fought in a war on this scale before, were inspired by Menelik's leadership and the clarity of their cause. They knew that the fate of their country rested on their shoulders. For them, this was not just a war for territory. It was a war to protect their homes, their families, and their way of life. It was a war to ensure that Ethiopia remained free, a beacon of African sovereignty in the face of European imperialism. The Italian army, on the other hand, faced growing challenges as it continued its advance into the Ethiopian interior. Supply lines were stretched thin, and the troops began to suffer from diseases like malaria, which spread rapidly in the hot and humid climate. The lack of adequate supplies and reinforcements compounded the difficulties faced by the Italians. Worse still, the Italian soldiers were growing increasingly frustrated by their inability to break the Ethiopian resistance. What had initially seemed like an easy victory for Italy was rapidly becoming a protracted and costly war. The situation reached a breaking point in early 1896, as the two armies converged at a place called Adwa, a strategic location in the mountains of northern Ethiopia. It was here that the final confrontation between the two forces would take place. For Menelik, the Battle of Adwa would be the culmination of years of preparation, of uniting his people, and of ensuring that Ethiopia stood strong in the face of foreign aggression. As the Italian forces approached Adwa, they believed that they could still secure a victory through sheer force. They underestimated not only the strategic capabilities of Menelik, but also the resolve of the Ethiopian soldiers. Menelik's army, now fully mobilized and in position, was prepared to defend their homeland at all costs. The terrain, which had been a challenge for the Italians throughout their campaign, would now become their greatest obstacle. The Battle of Adwa began with an Ethiopian assault that quickly overwhelmed the Italian forces. Menelik's strategy of using the terrain to his advantage, coupled with his soldiers' knowledge of the land, proved to be decisive. The Italians, who had expected to engage in a conventional battle, found themselves caught in a guerrilla-style conflict, with Ethiopian soldiers attacking from all sides. The Ethiopian army, composed of thousands of men, was able to encircle the Italian forces and deliver a crushing blow. The battle was a resounding victory for Ethiopia, one that shocked the world. The Italians, having suffered heavy casualties, were forced to retreat in disgrace. The Battle of Adwa was not only a military triumph for Menelik, but also a symbolic victory for Ethiopia and for Africa as a whole. It demonstrated that a well-organized, united African nation could stand up to European imperialism and emerge victorious. In the aftermath of the battle, Menelik's leadership was hailed as one of the greatest in African history. His ability to unite Ethiopia's people, to adapt to the challenges of war, and to defeat a European power was a triumph not only of military strategy, but of national resilience. Ethiopia's victory at Adwa sent a powerful message to the world, particularly to the colonial powers that had long sought to dominate Africa. It proved that Africa's sovereignty could not be easily taken and that the continent's nations had the power to resist imperialism and protect their independence. For Menelik, the victory at Adwa was the culmination of his vision for Ethiopia, a vision in which his country would remain independent, free from foreign control, and capable of standing on its own in the face of global challenges. The battle had been hard fought, but it had shown the world that Ethiopia was not a nation to be underestimated. The Italian defeat at Adwa was a turning point in the history of Africa, marking the first time that a European colonial power had been decisively defeated by an African nation. It was a moment that would resonate throughout the continent for generations to come, inspiring future movements for independence and self-determination across Africa. The victory at Adwa reverberated across the world, and its significance was not lost on anyone. For Ethiopia, it was not merely a military triumph, but a symbolic declaration of independence that would inspire generations to come. Menelik II's decisive leadership and the resilience of his people had delivered Ethiopia from the brink of colonization, and in doing so, they had struck a blow to the very heart of European imperialism in Africa. The implications of this victory stretched far beyond Ethiopia's borders, signaling to the colonial powers that Africa was not a passive continent waiting to be conquered. The battle at Adwa, a stunning and historic defeat for Italy, sent a clear message that African nations, when united and determined, could withstand even the most powerful European forces. In Ethiopia, the mood was one of immense pride and jubilation. Menelik, who had led his people to this momentous victory, was heralded as a national hero, not just for his military genius, but for his unwavering commitment to Ethiopia's sovereignty. The country's sense of national identity, which had been in flux due to regional divisions and the pressures of modernity, was solidified by this victory. Ethiopians from every ethnic group, region, and walk of life had come together in defense of their homeland, and this unity was a powerful testament to the strength of Menelik's leadership. But the aftermath of Adwa was not without its complexities. The victory, while historic, did not erase the challenges Ethiopia still faced, both internally and externally. The Ethiopian empire was deeply fractured, with significant regional differences that Menelik had been able to manage but not entirely reconcile. Although the battle had united the country in the short term, Ethiopia still had to grapple with the task of creating a more cohesive political structure. Menelik had managed to build a powerful military force, but there remained the question of how to integrate the various regional leaders and factions into a unified national government. The victory at Adwa had brought the country together for a common cause, but the work of nation-building was far from over. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw Ethiopia celebrating its victory, but Menelik knew that the road ahead would require careful diplomacy and political acumen. Despite the defeat at Adwa, Italy was not willing to abandon its imperial ambitions entirely. Though humiliated, Italy still held out hope that it could recover from its defeat and eventually gain some foothold in Ethiopia. The Italian government, already facing domestic pressure, was not prepared to let go of its dreams of empire in Africa. Menelik, ever astute, understood that his victory at Adwa had not secured Ethiopia's safety for the long term. The international balance of power had shifted, but the forces of colonialism were far from extinguished. He had won a battle, but the war to preserve Ethiopia's independence was far from over. Following the battle, Menelik took measures to consolidate his gains. One of the first actions he took was to reaffirm Ethiopia's sovereignty on the world stage. The defeat of Italy at Adwa had stunned the European powers, but it also forced them to reconsider their colonial ambitions in Ethiopia. For the first time, Ethiopia's independence was recognized by major powers such as Russia, France, and Great Britain. These diplomatic recognitions were crucial, as they provided Ethiopia with the international legitimacy it needed to secure its future. Menelik, who had long relied on diplomacy to maintain Ethiopia's autonomy, now used his military victory as a tool to strengthen his country's position on the global stage. Yet, Ethiopia's victory at Adwa did not end the pressure from European powers. Though the Italians had been decisively defeated, the colonial powers of Europe had not given up on their ambitions for Africa. Menelik, understanding the dynamics of international politics, continued to build diplomatic ties with European countries. He carefully navigated the complex web of alliances, ensuring that Ethiopia's independence was not undermined by the shifting interests of the great powers. His strategy was one of cautious engagement, relying on diplomatic maneuvering and the power of Ethiopia's military victory to keep the colonial powers at bay. Internally, Menelik faced challenges of his own. While his victory at Adwa had united Ethiopians in the face of foreign aggression, the underlying tensions within the empire were far from resolved. Ethiopia's diverse population, composed of various ethnic groups, languages, and cultures, still struggled with a lack of cohesive national identity. Menelik had forged a sense of unity among the Ethiopian people through the shared experience of war, but it would take more than a single military victory to heal the divisions that had long plagued the country. The empire's political structure, based on a loose confederation of regions and kingdoms, was not well equipped to foster the kind of centralized government that could address Ethiopia's growing needs. In the wake of Adwa, Menelik worked to strengthen his rule and extend his influence over the various regions. He sought to establish a more centralized administration, but the task was fraught with difficulties. Many of Ethiopia's regional leaders, who had fought alongside Menelik during the war, were unwilling to cede power to his central authority. These leaders were deeply invested in their own territories, and their autonomy had been a key feature of Ethiopia's political structure for centuries. Menelik's challenge was to balance the demands of centralization with the need to maintain the support of these regional leaders, who were essential to his continued rule. The issue of Ethiopia's finances also became pressing in the aftermath of the battle. War is an expensive endeavor, and while Menelik had gained an immense amount of prestige, the cost of the war effort was staggering. Ethiopia, with its limited infrastructure and resources, found itself in dire need of financial assistance to rebuild its army, maintain order, and modernize its economy. Menelik began to look to international financial support, hoping to secure loans and investments from Europe to help stabilize the country. However, the delicate nature of Ethiopia's diplomatic relationships meant that Menelik had to tread carefully in his dealings with foreign powers. As Menelik navigated these complex challenges, the reverberations of Adwa continued to echo throughout Africa. The defeat of Italy had become a rallying cry for anti-colonial movements across the continent. Ethiopia, as the last free African nation, had shown the world that it was possible to resist European imperialism. The victory at Adwa inspired nationalists and liberation movements from Egypt to South Africa, from Senegal to Kenya. It was a victory that not only secured Ethiopia's independence, but also provided a beacon of hope for all African nations still under the yoke of colonial rule. But even as Menelik navigated the difficult political and financial terrain, his victory at Adwa remained a point of pride for Ethiopians and a symbol of their resilience. The battle had been hard-fought, and the cost of victory had been high, but it had preserved Ethiopia's independence and given the country a place of honor on the world stage. Menelik's leadership had transformed him into an icon not only in Ethiopia, but also in Africa. His ability to unite a fractured nation, build a powerful military, and decisively defeat a European power had made him one of Africa's most revered leaders. The post-Adwa period was a time of reflection, consolidation, and transition for Ethiopia. Menelik, having secured the country's survival, now faced the challenge of modernizing his nation. He had successfully defended Ethiopia against foreign invaders, but the work of nation-building was far from complete. Ethiopia's political, economic, and social systems needed to evolve to meet the demands of the modern world. Menelik's legacy, shaped by his leadership in both war and diplomacy, would lay the foundation for Ethiopia's future, a future in which the country would stand not only as a symbol of resistance, but as a beacon of self-determination for Africa. The echoes of victory at Adwa had barely begun to fade when Menelik II found himself faced with the monumental task of ensuring Ethiopia's long-term stability and independence. The war had not only solidified Ethiopia's sovereignty, but it also transformed Menelik from a regional leader into a symbol of African resistance against European colonialism. However, the battle had come at a great cost, and now the real work of rebuilding, consolidating power, and safeguarding Ethiopia's future was at hand. The emperor, while widely celebrated for his military acumen, was aware that the challenges of governance and nation-building would prove to be as daunting as the battle that had secured his nation's freedom. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Adwa, Menelik's first concern was the well-being of his people and the restoration of order within the empire. Despite the euphoria that followed the victory, Ethiopia, like many war-torn nations, had suffered considerable material and human losses. The war, though victorious, had drained the country's resources, and the state of the economy was precarious. Agricultural production had been disrupted, roads and infrastructure damaged, and many soldiers and civilians alike had been killed or wounded. Ethiopia's victory was undoubtedly a triumph of national unity, but it had also left the country with the task of healing its wounds and rebuilding a nation that had been ravaged by the stress of warfare. Menelik's government, which had been relatively stable before the conflict, now faced the challenge of reconsolidating control over the vast territories of Ethiopia. The empire, though united in its resistance to foreign invasion, remained politically fragmented. Ethiopia was a land of diverse ethnic groups, regional warlords, and traditional power structures, all of which had their own interests and goals. Menelik's success in uniting the nation against the Italians had been largely due to his ability to leverage the shared sense of national identity created by the war. However, that unity, forged in the fires of conflict, was fragile. With the external threat gone, Menelik needed to address the internal divisions that still threatened to tear the empire apart. The most pressing of these divisions were the tensions between the central government in Addis Ababa and the various regional leaders who controlled vast areas of the country. These regional powers were often more loyal to their local kingdoms or tribes than to the emperor himself. Menelik had been able to rely on their support during the war, but now that the external threat had been vanquished, their loyalty was no longer guaranteed. These regional leaders controlled private armies and had considerable influence over the people in their territories. Any attempt by Menelik to centralize power too aggressively risked alienating these leaders and sparking internal conflict that could undermine the very unity that had won the battle against Italy. As a result, Menelik had to tread carefully in his efforts to centralize authority. He knew that without the cooperation of the regional elites, the stability of his government would be at risk. Therefore, he worked to strike a delicate balance between maintaining his own power and ensuring that the regional leaders felt secure in their autonomy. One of his primary strategies was to offer rewards to the local elites who had supported him during the war. Many of the commanders who had fought under Menelik were given land, titles, and military rank in return for their loyalty. This patronage system, while effective in the short term, had its drawbacks. It often entrenched regionalism by increasing the power of local leaders rather than fostering a sense of national unity. Still, Menelik's ability to manage these leaders without completely undermining his own authority was one of his greatest achievements during this period. In addition to the challenges of regional autonomy, Menelik was also faced with the task of modernizing Ethiopia's military and economy. Though Ethiopia had successfully repelled the Italian invasion, the country's military capabilities were still relatively primitive by global standards. Menelik understood that Ethiopia's military success in 1896 had been due, in large part, to the resilience of his soldiers, the strategic use of terrain, and the unity of purpose that the war had fostered. However, he was acutely aware that Ethiopia could not rely solely on these factors in the future. Modernization was essential, not just for defense, but for Ethiopia's survival in a world that was increasingly dominated by imperialist powers. To that end, Menelik began efforts to modernize Ethiopia's infrastructure and military. He sought to build a more professional and capable army, one that could better defend Ethiopia against future threats and also maintain internal stability. His government began to import modern weapons, including rifles, machine guns, and artillery, and he sought to reform the military by introducing formal training programs for officers and soldiers alike. However, the task was not easy. The lack of industrialization in Ethiopia meant that the country was heavily reliant on foreign imports for modern equipment. This dependence on outside sources for arms and supplies would remain a vulnerability for Ethiopia in the years to come. In addition to military modernization, Menelik focused on improving the country's infrastructure. Ethiopia's roads, railways, and communication systems were underdeveloped, which made it difficult for the central government to maintain control over its far-flung territories. Menelik sought to build roads and railways that could connect Ethiopia's major cities and facilitate the movement of goods, people, and military forces. However, Ethiopia's lack of a strong industrial base made it difficult to carry out these large-scale projects without foreign assistance. Menelik was again forced to turn to European powers for help. He was able to secure loans and technical assistance from Russia and France, but this placed Ethiopia in a precarious position. By becoming dependent on foreign loans, Menelik risked entangling Ethiopia in a web of debt that could compromise its independence in the future. Despite these efforts at modernization, Menelik was also aware of the internal problems that could arise from these changes. The introduction of modern infrastructure and military systems threatened to disrupt traditional ways of life in Ethiopia, particularly in rural areas. Many Ethiopians, especially those in the countryside, remained deeply suspicious of the changes brought by Menelik's centralizing government. The emperor's vision of a modern, centralized state clashed with the traditional structures of Ethiopian society, where local leaders held significant power and influence. The modernization of Ethiopia, therefore, was not simply a technical or economic challenge. It was also a cultural and political one. Menelik had to ensure that the changes he implemented did not alienate the very people who had supported him during the war. Menelik's reign, though marked by relative peace and stability following the victory at Adwa, also saw rising tensions between the emperor and his regional allies. While many of the regional leaders had been loyal to Menelik during the war, their loyalty was not absolute. Some began to chafe under the emperor's growing centralization of power, and there were murmurs of discontent among those who felt that their autonomy was being undermined. Menelik, ever shrewd in his political calculations, responded by offering concessions to these leaders, ensuring their cooperation while still strengthening his own hold on power. The delicate balance he maintained between centralization and decentralization allowed Ethiopia to remain stable in the years following Adwa, but it also meant that regional power struggles continued to simmer beneath the surface. The legacy of Menelik's reign would ultimately be one of both success and limitation. On the one hand, he had secured Ethiopia's independence at a critical moment in history, preserving the country's sovereignty in the face of European imperialism. The victory at Adwa had made Ethiopia a symbol of African resistance, and Menelik's diplomatic efforts had ensured that Ethiopia remained recognized as a sovereign nation in the international arena. On the other hand, his efforts to modernize the country were incomplete, and Ethiopia remained a largely agrarian society with significant regional disparities. The political system he inherited, though strong enough to fend off external threats, was not entirely suited to the demands of modern governance. In the years following his victory, Menelik's health began to decline. The emperor, who had once been the embodiment of strength and decisiveness, grew weaker, and the question of succession became an increasingly pressing issue. Menelik's failure to establish a clear succession plan would have profound implications for Ethiopia's future, as his eventual abdication in 1913 would leave the empire vulnerable to internal instability and external pressures. Though his reign had brought Ethiopia unparalleled success in the face of colonialism, the nation's future remained uncertain, and the challenges of maintaining unity and stability would persist long after Menelik's departure from the throne. Menelik's reign left a complex legacy, one that continues to be debated in Ethiopia today. His victory at Adwa and the political and military decisions he made in the aftermath secured Ethiopia's place in history as the only African nation to defeat a European colonial power. Yet, the internal challenges he faced in consolidating power and modernizing the country highlighted the limitations of his rule. Menelik's Ethiopia was a country on the cusp of modernity, but it was also a nation deeply rooted in tradition and local power structures. The task of navigating these contradictions would fall to future leaders, who would be tasked with continuing Menelik's work while confronting new challenges in a rapidly changing world. The years following the stunning victory at Adwa were marked by a complex blend of triumph and challenge for Ethiopia. Menelik II's leadership had secured the country's place as a symbol of African resistance against European colonialism, but the path forward was not without significant hurdles. Though Ethiopia had, in 1896, defeated one of the most powerful European military forces, the war for its survival was far from over. Ethiopia's independence remained fragile, and the emperor, though revered, now found himself at the helm of a country that needed much more than just military victories to ensure its continued stability and prosperity. While Menelik's leadership had brought Ethiopia to the forefront of global consciousness as an African power capable of defending its sovereignty, the underlying challenges of governance loomed large. The victory at Adwa had not erased the complexities within Ethiopia's political structure. The empire was a patchwork of diverse ethnic groups, each with its own traditions, languages, and political allegiances. Ethiopia's centralized political system, while effective in mobilizing the country for war, was not fully equipped to deal with the pressures of nation-building in the aftermath of such a profound military achievement. The country's traditional power structures, regional leaders, landowners, and local warlords retained considerable influence, and their cooperation was essential for the smooth running of the empire. One of the most pressing issues was the challenge of consolidating power. Menelik's success at Adwa had been due in large part to his ability to unite these diverse groups under a common cause. However, now that the immediate external threat had been eliminated, the emperor had to confront the more difficult task of navigating Ethiopia's internal political landscape. The regional elites, who had rallied behind Menelik during the war, were beginning to demand greater autonomy. Their loyalty to the emperor, forged in the fires of battle, was no longer guaranteed, and the delicate balance between centralization and decentralization began to shift. Menelik's strategy had always been one of pragmatic diplomacy. He understood the importance of maintaining the support of regional leaders, and he had used a system of patronage to secure their loyalty during the war. However, as the years passed, it became clear that this system of patronage had its limitations. The central government, based in Addis Ababa, began to face increasing resistance from regional leaders who felt that their power was being encroached upon. These leaders, who had been vital in organizing the defense against the Italian invasion, now saw the emperor's push for centralization as a direct challenge to their own authority. Menelik, though astute in his political maneuvering, found himself in a difficult position. On one hand, he had to assert his authority over the entire empire to ensure the stability and unity of the country. On the other hand, he needed to avoid alienating the regional elites, who controlled vast territories and commanded loyalty from large segments of the population. This tension between central authority and regional autonomy would be a recurring theme in Menelik's later years, and it would become a defining challenge in the empire's development. Despite these internal challenges, Menelik continued to focus on the modernization of Ethiopia. The emperor understood that his country could not afford to rest on its laurels after the victory at Adwa. Ethiopia, although it had successfully resisted European imperialism, remained a largely agrarian society with a limited industrial base. The country's infrastructure, particularly in terms of transportation and communication, was rudimentary at best. Roads were few and poorly maintained, and a rail network was underdeveloped. Menelik knew that in order to safeguard Ethiopia's future, he needed to modernize the country, both economically and militarily. The emperor's attempts to modernize Ethiopia were not without difficulty. The country's lack of industrialization and the absence of a strong economic base meant that many of the resources needed for modernization had to be imported from abroad. Menelik was forced to rely on European powers for technical assistance, loans, and expertise. While his diplomatic skills allowed him to secure some assistance from Russia and France, Ethiopia remained vulnerable to the influence of foreign powers. The increasing dependency on foreign loans and technical assistance posed a potential risk to Ethiopia's sovereignty. Menelik understood that the key to securing Ethiopia's future was to strike a careful balance, modernizing the country without falling into a situation where foreign influence would undermine Ethiopia's independence. The need for modernization was most acutely felt in the military. While Ethiopia had proven its military strength in the Battle of Adwa, the country's forces were still far behind the European powers in terms of technology and training. The war had highlighted the importance of modern weapons, such as rifles, artillery, and machine guns, but Ethiopia's ability to produce these weapons locally was limited. The emperor began efforts to establish arms manufacturing plants within the country, but progress was slow. In the meantime, Menelik continued to rely on foreign arms suppliers to equip his army. While the victory at Adwa had been a triumph of Ethiopian resilience, Menelik knew that future battles would not be won with sheer determination alone. They would require advanced weaponry and a modern military infrastructure. At the same time, Ethiopia's social and economic development remained stagnant. The majority of the population lived in rural areas and worked in agriculture. The absence of a robust industrial sector meant that Ethiopia was heavily reliant on foreign imports, which placed a strain on the country's finances. The government had few means of generating revenue beyond taxation, and much of the economy was still based on traditional forms of subsistence farming. Menelik knew that the country could not thrive under such conditions, but his efforts to stimulate industrialization were hindered by the lack of infrastructure, financial resources, and a skilled labor force. In addition to the challenges of modernization, Menelik was also faced with the issue of succession. The emperor, who had once been a figure of boundless energy and strategic brilliance, was beginning to show signs of declining health. Menelik's reign had already spanned more than 2 decades, and as he grew older, the question of who would succeed him became more pressing. Ethiopia's system of government, which was based on a form of monarchy, had no clear line of succession. Though Menelik had a number of children, there was no definitive heir, and the absence of a clear successor created uncertainty about the future of the empire.